This is an intervention for The Hobbit, a film series I love with a lot of problems. So this is tough love. So is The Hobbit good? Yes and no. The general consensus is either divisive or muddled. I've seen the trilogy over 10 times, so I'm definitely a fan, but in a lot of ways I'm still disappointed. What we have is a 9-hour epic adapting an iconic book filled with beautiful images, a passionate story, likable characters, spot-on actors, incredible costumes, and fantastic sets. And yet, something's missing.
I feel thin.
Most people feel fairly lukewarm, even if they like it. Why is that? The truest answer is The Lord of the Rings. In a vacuum, The Hobbit should be hailed for its many achievements. Compared to any fantasy movie of its time, it's remarkable. It's only a failure in the shadow of Lord of the Rings, a trilogy I consider perfect. The Hobbit was inevitably doomed to fail from the beginning, unable to measure up to hype and high expectations, but surely this wasn't the best they could do. Well, maybe it was. It's notorious what a pre-production nightmare The Hobbit was. The whole project started after New Line merged with Warner Brothers. The Tolkien estate sued New Line. MGM was basically bankrupt and wouldn't sell the film rights.
This is a nightmare.
Guillermo del Toro was originally the director, and he helped write the script and design creatures and sets. But after 2 years of production limbo, he had to step down because the movie wasn't being made.
Because Guillermo del Toro had to leave and I sort of jumped in and took over, we didn't wind the clock back a year and a half and give me a year and a half prep to design the movie I was going to make, which was different to what he was doing.
That meant a lot of designs had to be scrapped. Lord of the Rings had about 2 years of pre-production, and The Hobbit only a few months. Then Peter got a stomach ulcer, and they lost the original Feely, who del Toro stole for Pacific Rim anyway.
I'll see you around, Raleigh.
The Hobbit directed by Guillermo del Toro would have been a very different film, better or worse. In the end, I'm happy Peter directed, because the trilogies are so linked, they feel visually consistent. But I can't help but wonder what del Toro would have done.
As a fan, I have to be respectful and say that's the best version of the films.
Maybe a new vision would have eliminated that tethered nostalgia problem The Hobbit always felt stuck in.
I don't know if any other director could have done this. I suppose they could have done, but that's not the point. He did them.
But a rushed pre-production can lead to more obvious problems. First is time. Unless you're Boyhood, a film is always a race against time.
Peter never got a chance to prep these movies. I can't say that, but he didn't.
Second is time, again. But this is an artist's time. Writers and artists are creative people, and creativity doesn't magically appear. It develops. Slowly. When a creator is put on the spot, the first idea isn't always the best. Time can temper some outlandish thoughts, or allow for better understanding of the material. So it's no surprise when the crew heard Radagast's sled was pulled by giant rabbits, everyone thought it was just as stupid as we did.
The rabbits would probably be reasonably large rabbits.
I personally, I thought he was joking. What do you mean large rabbits? That's crazy. Yeah, that's crazy. What?
We need to find the biggest rabbit in the country and see how big they are.
At the back of my mind, I did have to think, I don't buy this.
When everyone thinks your idea is a joke, you should probably reconsider it. The people around Peter share the blame for not challenging some of the weaker ideas. But all his artists trust him because of his previous success. How can you argue against the genius behind Lord of the Rings? I draw the line at Rabbit Sled. I guess it could have worked, but why take that chance? It feels more like something out of the Narnia books. It would have helped if they actually modeled the rabbits after the giant ones Peter talked about. But they look more mangy and cartoony. I'm willing to bet if they let that idea sit for 2 years, they would have come to their senses. And what about Beorn? Who thought this was a good idea? They even had to scale his mullet down digitally because it was already too distracting.
We started seeing it in lots of shots. It started to draw too much attention to itself. So Fran and Pete really wanted to do was to squash it down some. So we actually ended up flattening his mohawk.
In the book, he's basically described as a black-haired, bearded lumberjack, basically called Drogo. Do you think they avoided designing him like this because Game of Thrones was so popular? I don't know, but this was the only other alternative? Then you hear stories about the Lord of the Rings and deleted scenes. Aragorn was supposed to fight the embodiment of Sauron at the Black Gate, which they later changed to the Troll. Arwen showed up at Helm's Deep. Frodo turned into Gollum in the Premonition. When you have the time to think about what you're doing, you're able to make decisions that are better for the movie. Tolkien even made 2 other revisions to the book decades later. The Hobbit films didn't have that luxury. I absolutely respect Peter as a filmmaker, but it doesn't help that a lot of decisions were informed by the success of Lord of the Rings.
Sequel.
The sequel to what?
Sequel to the 3 biggest movies of the
entire history of the universe?
Prequels are contradictory. You're expanding a universe of familiar characters and settings because an already existing franchise is popular. Sequentially, you have to outdo what was made before, but chronologically the story can't be more exciting. You have to push new boundaries, but cater to images we're nostalgic for. Character tension is harder because we're collectively aware of where the characters end up, and continuity is scrutinized under a microscope. How could Professor X be in a wheelchair in first class, but walk in the opening of X-Men 3, then return to a wheelchair for the original trilogy, then die and somehow transplant himself in a twin body but still need a wheelchair? The Hobbit actually survives most continuity errors thanks to the book and coincidental references in Lord of the Rings.
3 monstrous trolls, and they were all arguing amongst themselves about how they were going to cook us. My old sword. Why don't we have a game of riddles?
If you're referring to the incident with the dragon, I was barely involved. I will show you the way. Bilbo had a set of mithril rings that Thorin gave him.
Balin, at yourself.
Here lies Barley, the son of Undine.
It's a pity Bilbo didn't kill him when he had the chance.
Pity? It was pity that stayed Bilbo's hand.
We don't want any more visitors, well-wishers, or distant relations.
What about very old friends?
And though it's sort of obvious, I respect them for following continuity. It always baffles me when prequels can't follow their own setups. If they didn't truly care, they would have missed some important things. I could watch all 6 movies and everything would line up pretty seamlessly. Except 2 things. 1. Why isn't the scene where Bilbo finds the ring the same as in Lord of the Rings? I get that there's a collision of 2 actors performing the same scene, and I'd never want to see Ian Holm replaced, but they aren't even close. They didn't have to shoot it the same way. Maybe a high angle on the exact same scene. Bilbo in the dirt and fumbling for the ring with the same line. I don't know why they'd change it. You could argue it's a remembrance of Bilbo in the prologue. Often we don't see ourselves as we were. We imagine a younger version of our current self, but that's just an excuse for bad continuity. 2. I also have a problem with Ian Holm's hair. Other than looking ridiculously older, his hair, which is a wig, is noticeably different. In The Lord of the Rings, his hair had curls and bounce to it, but here it's straight and flat and sort of sags on his head. I assume they wanted to match it to Martin Freeman's hair, but it comes across wrong to me. Another prequel problem comes from raising the stakes in a story that isn't as interesting. Not only is The Hobbit trying to match The Lord of the Rings, but it's also trying to be a faithful book adaptation. 2 contradictory goals. The Hobbit is a naive adventure story, and The Lord of the Rings is a war drama. They tried to incorporate both to appeal to everyone, but the tone suffered because of it.
I didn't want to make a children's film per se, but at the same time I wanted to have it more comedic than The Lord of the Rings and be able to sort of capture something of the flavour, but also feel like we had a foot in the Lord of the Rings door as well.
What resulted was forced humor and gritty violence, and I'm not sure how you could ever pull it off. It should have been one or the other, but I applaud them for trying. I would have preferred if it was as dark as Lord of the Rings. The original trilogy wasn't devoid of humor, but it had more weight and subtlety behind it.
What about breakfast?
We've already had it.
We've had one, yes. What about second breakfast?
At the very least, it was more realistic. There was a softness and a maturity. The Hobbit still could have been about innocence if it was heavier. To be honest, The Hobbit's plot isn't as interesting, and that's not a bad thing if you treat it that way. The book knew it was a simple tale, but Tolkien wrote it so beautifully and synthesized fairy tale classics into one story. A simple man encounters strange things. Elevating it to Lord of the Rings proportions is just misdirection. That doesn't mean it can't be creepy or dark or dramatic like Lord of the Rings, but it can't be Lord of the Rings. The originals always had a looming threat and a strong goal. Destroy the ring or the world dies. What's The Hobbit about? Killing the dragon and taking the gold. Why risk it? It's really an excuse to showcase adventure, but when you try to emphasize every action as a critical setup to Lord of the Rings, it's self-defeating.
And it also establishes a world that, is later developed in The Lord of the Rings.
The company runs into trolls and orcs, which seems pretty common in Middle-earth.
Orcs have attacked us on the road.
But Gandalf the Paranoid thinks it's because Sauron's returned. The goblins are practically best buds with Azog for some reason, who's also a servant of Sauron, the reason the quest even started. Then Radagast finds a Morgul blade. The Greenwood decays into Mirkwood in a matter of days because of the Necromancer. Azog apparently killed all of Beorn's people.
The Defiler killed most of my family.
Well, that's convenient. Who knew this bastard was so central to the fight of Middle-earth? If he didn't set all of this into motion, Bilbo never would have found the ring. Azog's apparently the key to everything, huh? I'm almost surprised the Stone Giants weren't also influenced by Sauron too. Why not? Sauron could give them all cancer at this point. See, I always saw the plot of The Hobbit as incidental. Bilbo found the ring on accident and set in motion events he nor anyone else intended.
Bilbo was meant to find the ring, in which case you also were meant to have it.
The Hobbit was a coincidental story that intersected the War of the Ring. Linking everything back to the Lord of the Rings undermines what the story's all about. Peter tried to inject the appendices like steroids, and I realize these events actually happened in the book, but they were vague references or historical excerpts. I love seeing Galadriel and Saruman again, but I can't help but feel it was all because of nostalgia. If this was about accuracy of detail, why wasn't Celeborn there? Or Radagast, or other elf lords? It'd be as if the Council of Elrond was composed of only the Fellowship members and none of the background characters. Gloin the Dwarf was even there, and the White Council doesn't even do anything. Gandalf just discovers clues on his own until the members attack Dol Guldur. One of the biggest problems with prequels is how much you have to reiterate yourself. Do you have to explain the Force again, or what a Jedi is? Should you establish what a mutant is? I knew someone who had no idea what the X-Men were. When she watched First Class, she was pretty confused when people suddenly started using superpowers. Of course, you don't have to reestablish minor details like what hobbits are, because you can see their traits in Bilbo's personality. But I do believe prequels should stand on their own without prior knowledge. Sequels are different. You have to assume people have seen the first Back to the Future if they're watching Back to the Future 2.
And if you go into the Two Towers without having seen the Fellowship of the Ring, maybe that wasn't the best idea.
It's sequential order, but not everyone who watched The Hobbit saw Lord of the Rings, and nor should they have to. You're actively establishing this as the beginning of everything, right?
It's the beginnings of these, of the pieces of the puzzle that lead to the great fight for Middle-earth.
Which means you have to present things as if they're new. This brings us to Sauron. I understand his presence as a necromancer, but everyone talks about him like the antiquated Dark Lord that he was.
Sauron is vanquished. He can never regain his full strength.
Who are we talking about? They even up his importance by tying him to Smaug.
Smaug owes allegiance to no one. But if he should side with the enemy...
Now, sending an army to the Lonely Mountain for its wealth and strategy makes more sense than revenge for the death of the Goblin King. But Sauron's importance was way too overblown for so little explanation. They don't say much more than he's an enemy who was vanquished. I'm not asking for another Lord of the Rings prologue. They should at least establish who he is for the first time. See, I'm actually okay with Bilbo finding the shards of Narsil and the painting of Sauron because they're subtle references, not blatant name drops.
It is known in the wild as Strider.
My name is Kar.
That's my wee lad, Gimli.
Surely there was a subtler take than that. You didn't want to name drop your wife, I guess? What works with the painting is that it actually sets up the ring later in the movie. There's a history behind it. At least all the previous characters are introduced to us, but then characters like Dain and Beorn are just afterthoughts. They show up for a scene or two, then vanish from the movie. Remember how Boromir still affected the other two films even after he died? There was an extended scene when he was a good man. We see his life through Faramir and how Frodo and Sam reacted to his death. In the third film, Denethor's character is so obsessive with his son's splendor that he alienates his only remaining son.
Boromir was loyal to me!
When a character is actually fleshed out, you can get a lot of mileage out of them even if they aren't in the scene. So now I want to talk about a lot of common criticisms of The Hobbit and what I think about it. CGI is starting to sound like a taboo word these days. All anyone has to say is that your movie has too much CGI, and that's enough valid criticism for a movie's quality.
Digital effects now allow the audience to think everything is digital bullshit.
So why is too much CGI bad? The biggest factor in a movie is time and money. The process actually saves time and money, but when it's the solution for everything, it ends up looking rushed. It's a lazy fix when it's too much effort to capture something in camera. Why build a set when you can add it later? Or why bother the art department if you can digitally create an orc?
In those days, we couldn't do as much with computers, and so we had to have hundreds and hundreds of extras that, in hot costumes and people fainting. And
in a lot of ways, it's a courtesy to the crew, like when all the goblin extras were overheating and they decided to do it later. It's especially useful when the movie comes out in 2 weeks and you need a shot to finish the movie. So why did Peter change over the 10 years?
Peter wanted to be an effects guy at the very beginning of his career. He had thoughts that maybe that's what he would do. So he used to make his own puppets and creatures and props and models and then get to film them.
The good old days, eh?
I think Peter Jackson, George Lucas, and James Cameron are all big believers in digital filmmaking because they made the biggest practical effects movies ever, and they know what a hassle it is.
You know, I always had a desire to want to do digital orcs and goblins back in the Lord of the Rings days. But, the last 10 years, things have advanced so quickly, and we have completely digital characters now all over the place.
Thankfully, there were limitations at the time.
There would be something about their movements and their fluidity that would be creepy if they were CGI, but we just couldn't afford it. I tended to shoot in slow motion because it was the only way I could make them look vaguely creepy.
But effort on screen is what we respond to. It's like they're former athletes who think they can still run marathons if they spend all day on the couch.
You're presenting complete unreality and making them feel like it's real. Whereas before it was captured in reality.
When was it ever real? There was a kind of a wall there and nothing over there. There were 30 people standing around. There's a guy with a boom mic. There's another guy up on a ladder with his ass crack hanging out. There's fake rain. Your street night exterior New York was a day interior Burbank. What was ever real?
What's real is something tangible being captured in a camera. Something with weight, something affected by light, something that affects light, something actors can respond to. Rain may come from rain towers, but it's real water. Sunlight may come from lighting rigs, but it's real light. Styrofoam can be painted and sculpted to look like beautiful wood carvings. To assume nothing's real in a movie just because it's stitched together defeats the point of even making movies. Magic tricks aren't real either, but the illusion is. Movies transcend the screen and affect an audience emotionally through writing, cinematography, and drama. When an audience laughs, that's real. When an audience cries, that's real. Looking at a completely CGI shot and feeling apathy is an understandable reaction. I'll give you an example. There's an interesting Lord of the Rings story when Aragorn thinks Merry and Pippin were slaughtered and burned on a pyre.
The fourth take I thought was really good. I thought, well, that's pretty close. And then I thought, oh, look, he's got better each time. If I just give him one more take, I bet it's going to look great. So he boots this helmet. And then he let out this scream. I thought, wow, this is strong. I mean, this is like Aragorn is like just in total grief at what's just happened to Merry and Pippin. This is really cool. And he didn't say anything to us, but we found out that Viggo had actually broken 2 toes with that last kick. I mean, Viggo actually, feeling that pain, he actually turned that into performance.
I imagine if they made it today, they'd just CG the helmet later. This was something real that an actor reacted to, even if it was just the weight or the effort kicking the helmet. Some of the other takes were good too. I don't want people to be injured, but everyone got hurt on Lord of the Rings. Sean Astin got a piece of glass through his foot, Viggo Mortensen almost drowned, Orlando Bloom cracked his ribs, Gimli's stunt double dislocated his knee, and John Rhys Davies was allergic to the prosthetics every day of filming. Of course, not all of it is on screen, but you can see the crew putting in so much effort that these characters feel real. The art department eroded their fingerprints to make so much chainmail.
He said with my armor that he'd link 80,000 pieces of chainmail together.
I would not have traded this experience for the world.
Andy Serkis jumped into freezing water for one shot despite being a CG character, because he knew the performance was important to get right. Our 3 heroes were all struggling to run because they were injured, but they pushed through their pain.
Seriously, I mean, it was about sucking it up and standing by your fellow man, elf, or dwarf, or hobbit, wizard, and giving it your best shot.
There are so many shots in The Hobbit where groups of characters are CG at a distance. I know they would have called it quits here and said, don't worry guys, that's enough, we'll just add it in later. This is not to discredit CGI, because animators can spend years on a shot. You can use it for impossible things.
And just about anything you can come up with in your head you can put on screen now. There's no limitations anymore.
In fact, a lot of the extended edition battle scenes are so much fun because there's so much creativity, and a lot of it you might not get in camera. Some CGI shots can look so perfect, you're not even sure what's real. The greatest effects are the ones the crew cares about the most. This is why Smaug and Gollum look flawless, but the barrel scene is so cheesy. Because which scene do you think they were trying to get right?
Because I wanted it to be, you know, a memorable scene in the movie as it is in the book.
It's not to say that all the effects look great in Lord of the Rings. But the point is that a practical effect doesn't have to worry as much about looking real. It is real.
We still get to make things with our hands, that we still are able to use craft in the creation of our work.
Even the goofy puppets in Labyrinth were made from real felt and performed by actors. And no one minds if an effect is shoddy if the movie was great around it. Just take a look at Gollum in The Two Towers. By Return of the King, they worked out a lot of problems, but there are moments when he looks a little dated in the second one. But Andy Serkis's performance and character shines through, so it didn't matter. So a couple of things to help. Always do practical effects if you can. If it can be done in real life, and yes, it'll take effort, then it should be attempted. That means real people in suits sweating with real weapons and crashing into each other. Practical effects aren't just for our pleasure too. They help inform an actor's reaction.
Here we go, and action!
And that was incredibly complicated, and I was really nervous because I was like, this feels really weird. I'm walking on, you know, a blue mat, and there's blue around me, and there's no reference at all.
Watch the walk now, watch the walk, see it working. The walks are all below you, they're barking and they're going crazy. Here we go.
CGI is great for things we've never seen before, or enhancing already existing shots. Obviously, I don't expect the dragon or troll to be a practical effect, and digital filmmaking is crucial for compositing shots. But you have to keep in mind what we've already seen before. If you've established a precedent of incredible prosthetics and makeup on hundreds of orcs, and market the entire trilogy around the originals, then you have to deliver on the things we loved about them too. Pointlessly name-dropping a character from Lord of the Rings isn't nearly as satisfying as seeing the same level of craftsmanship. If you choose to do CGI, keep it scaled down. Filmmakers keep trying to top themselves with crazy angles, fast-paced energy, and wild ideas. They can literally do anything, which is dangerous for a film. It's like a kid who's left alone and eats nothing but ice cream for dinner. People are really starting to get bored during action sequences because none of it affects us. Simplicity can make more of a difference than complexity ever could. In the original Lord of the Rings, most of the CGI was for large battle shots of 10,000 Uruk-hai, but it was still integrated with realistic plates.
I'd grown up in looking at battles in movies where you have 100 extras or 200 extras and you use a lot of smoke to hide the fact that there's only, that number, there's not really thousands. So I reveled in the opportunity to just see these numbers on screen.
I'm not going to argue that the CGI was better, but they varied the shots up with a wide range of realism. If they showed a big sweep of soldiers, then they'd cut in a couple of guys in suits. You have to ground what you do in reality so we can connect to it. Less action scenes means more time for better CGI. I hate the stone giant scene. It's overcomplicated, too long, and doesn't advance the plot. It's a nice book cameo, but they should have been in the background like the trolls in Lord of the Rings. But what aggravates me the most is how amazing it looks. Because it really looks flawless, and I know most of it's digital. But then I see a shot of Radagast's sled, or the ending in the pine forest, and some of the effects look awful. I imagine how much better all the movies could be if they had extra time by eliminating the stone giant sequence, or the barrel ride. Why are they fighting in this scene? In the book, they just float away. The danger comes from escaping captivity. Turning it into an action scene is excessive. In fact, Tolkien's books are not action stories. Seriously, there are some fights, there's danger, there's war, but it's mostly fantasy and history and drama. I remember as a kid reading The Lord of the Rings and anticipating the troll fight because it was so cool in the movie, but it's little more than a page long. Most of the action scenes are summarized in hindsight. Peter has basically made action movies out of these stories, which is fine. But actually go back and watch The Fellowship again. It's surprising how little action there is. There's a cool opening prologue, and there's some stuff with the ring wraiths, but this is the middle of the movie's big action scene. There's some big stuff in a row when the movie kicks off, but it's well over halfway through the movie. They spend such a time in Lothlorien that it earns a big fight at the end. Each set piece is memorable and part of the narrative. What actually holds it all together is the story being told, the characters, the situations. It's why we watch movies. I think filmmakers discredit the audience too much, thinking they won't be entertained unless you throw in an action scene. But some movies are so iconic just for their stories. They don't need a barrel fight or dragon hijinks at the end because the stories are satisfying without them. It's disappointing to see Peter sacrifice the beautiful craft of artists for poor CGI. I mean, they took the time to literally make a model for Lake Town, which they scanned for the digital version. All these artists are dying to show their ideas. It's what makes the movie rich and beautiful. It helps sell the story. This doesn't. It wouldn't matter if the story was still great, but the artists reveal more about the characters than the film does.
I sort of imagined that Beorn would carve motifs and symbols into his house.
I was very, very keen to put in specific references to Norse myth because Beorn is very much a character that's come to us through Tolkien directly from that mythology.
The drawings, the themes, the props, the furniture, the carvings, the motifs. It's magical to watch so much creativity. There's more thought and backstory in a set dressing than in a single line in the film. I'm not sure whether the studio pushed for 3 films or not. On one hand, it makes sense. Another movie makes more money. But Peter and Philippa seem to really love the idea of a 3rd movie.
It was a pretty easy decision to begin with to say, okay, we want to tell that part of the tale. And as soon as you begin to tell that part of the tale, there's also other parts of this tale.
Whatever the reason was, it doesn't really matter. Adding a movie really screwed things up. I don't actually mind the idea of 3 movies. If the story's great, they can do 5 movies for all I care. 2 might have been more efficient, but the problem was they decided it in the middle of production. Peter announced the split of movies just a couple of months before An Unexpected Journey came out. First, it ruined the perfect title of There and Back Again, which is just so pleasing to say. Then they added The Desolation of Smaug, which is probably one of the clunkiest titles ever. Second, the plot is so drawn out, it feels even slower over 3 movies. It feels like reaching a word count on an essay, so you have to include every little thing you can think of to meet the deadline. If the extra details were interesting, that would be amazing. Return of the King was 3 hours in the theatrical release and almost 4 in the extended edition. That's a movie with a lot of excess. None of the Hobbits even make it to 3 hours, and all the extended scenes only add about 20 minutes. It's stretched, not just in plot, but in pacing. It drags its heels. Third, the split decision ruined the endings of the first two films. I can't be sure where the first movie would have ended if there were only two. Maybe a hope is lost moment when all the dwarves are captured by the elves, or maybe a hopeful moment as they float peacefully down the river and see the lonely mountain in the distance. But essentially, they ended the movie with this dumb sequence with Azog that isn't exciting at all and filled with rushed effects. I would have preferred if they fought the goblins and Bilbo found the ring. That would have been satisfying without tacking on another 15 minutes. It gets even worse by the second movie because most of the changes and rewrites happen here because they had to fill the time. They had to cram in an action scene at the end with the dragon so it wasn't a letdown. It was cool to see a lot of Erebor, but it really starts to get far-fetched at a certain point. And the worst change comes from a digital Azog. In 2011, Conan Stevens, the first Gregor Clegane from Game of Thrones, was cast as Azog, which is one of the coolest character designs I've ever seen. But something must have happened because they used a different design in the Moria flashback. So Conan Stevens' Azog became Bolg. But Peter must not have liked the new design of Azog either, so he switched it to this random orc who gets killed. So basically, Azog was up in the air. Then they cast Manu Bennett to do the motion capture a few months before the movie was out. The obvious problem is that the effects are shoddier because it was a last-minute decision. This is the same technology they used for Gollum, but there's a big difference. The other question is, if they got the go-ahead to film this scene, did they add other scenes in post-production? Honestly, Azog has about 3 scenes in the first movie. Then there was a shot in the trailer of the second movie when he's fighting in the barrel sequence. They changed it to Bolg because I assume they already moved up the first showdown. I can't be sure, but I'd bet money they added most of the Azog subplot after the fact. You can't just change your movie midway through. I mean, they change lines every day in production.
Not because we were in trouble in any sense, but it was really to get as close to Tolkien as possible, and I think we were always trying to incorporate more of Tolkien into the movie.
But it doesn't actually change the narrative. So then there's a complicated dilemma, a digital Azog and a prosthetic Bolg. By the time of reshoots on the last 2 movies, the first one had already come out, so the clear choice was to make a digital Bolg to match, sacrificing one of the best creature designs for one of the dumbest. You can still see the old design on a random orc in the Dol Guldur scene because they filmed it at the beginning of the production, and it looks so stunning. Splitting the movies wasn't initially a bad decision, but it created a domino effect that crumbled under confused direction. But earlier decisions are just as baffling. The Hobbit was shot in 3D high frame rate. Most people know what 3D is, but if you don't know, a traditional movie is shot at 24 frames per second, which means in the space of a second, there are 24 frames of information, which gives the illusion of movement. The Hobbit was filmed at a higher frame rate, 48 frames per second. So in the space of a second, there are 48 frames of information. If you were able to see it, this, with a combination of 3D, made for a different theater experience, where everything was hyper real, super smooth, and had depth.
It's like the back of the cinema has had a hole cut out of it where the screen is, and you're actually looking into the real world.
Some people liked it, and some people hated it. I actually liked it a lot. Because it was such an immersive experience, I won't forget it. But that's not the point. I'm not bringing this up to judge how the 3D high frame rate looks, but filming it this way actually affected the way the movie was shot. One of the greatest effects can be a miniature, a small model, but in the context of editing and artistry, it can look massive. Most of the sets on Lord of the Rings were carefully crafted miniatures.
Where in many cases we would have done a matte painting, he's chosen to use a miniature instead, or a miniature with a slight bit of matte painting to blend it into live action. So we're doing a huge number of shots where we're dropping a miniature behind the live action scene, which is wonderful because it means that we get the beauty of the live action, and then we're able to expand it and amplify it and create the environment into which this live action scene will play. And that's pretty neat.
But because of the way The Hobbit was filmed, it supposedly revealed how fake it was. The model just looked like a model, and you could see how small it was. Same with matte paintings, because it would reveal that it's just a painting. So the only solution was to digitally create every environment that wasn't a giant set. Remember what I said about a digital workload? Every location had to take up time that could have been spent on other shots. It's also another tool in the special effects bucket that isn't being used. I'm fine that they shot on digital, because it's easier, and there's not so much difference from film. It helps speed up the color grading process too. But maybe that's not such a good idea because the color grading was kind of awful in The Hobbit. At least in the first one and some of the second. It's so vibrant and kind of ugly in a few places. There aren't those deep purples and soft silver lights like in Fellowship. But another lost special effect is forced perspective.
If you have 2 people of the same height and you want to make one of them look smaller, you simply take that person further away from the camera. So suddenly the camera is seeing somebody close at a certain height and somebody further away at a smaller height.
In the shot where Frodo is pouring tea for Gandalf at a table, and the camera kind of crabs past from one side of the table to the other side. And in that instance, Ian McKellen was actually sitting on a dolly that was actually moving him slightly on a small-scale table.
Although there was some digital compositing, a lot of the size effects in Lord of the Rings were in camera. They used some doubles in The Hobbit, but because it was filmed in 3D, it shattered the illusion of forced perspective. You could tell that a person was actually far away because of the depth. It's a little like art restoration. If you clean it up and make it better, you actually lose some of that texture, and it feels a little sterile. These points are nitpicks, but they reveal a certain level of thinking on The Hobbit. They're tracing a line without a ruler. What they want is to capture the same magic as the original Lord of the Rings, but they aren't using the same tools. There are so many ways to create effects.
You could literally have just guys with big clothes on and
big rubber hands walking by, which sounds very corny, and you would never want to do that in a wide shot. But in a tight shot, you're only seeing this much of the patron, and he just walks by. And so, but it still gives you this feeling that guys are walking by and that they're only 3'6" tall.
Miniatures, forced perspective, matte paintings, animatronics. They're almost lost arts today, and they shouldn't be. I don't think every effect should be preserved, like stop motion animation and live action. But when you can combine every great effect in one movie, it makes it believable.
We employed every trick from like absolute latest state-of-the-art digital technology to, rubber bands, chewing gum, like whatever you could drag out of a hat, all these old sleight of hands.
So I guess I should talk about the dwarves, since, they're the heroes. But are they? In the book, they're more of a collective, and only some of them talk. This is because Bilbo is the protagonist, and the dwarves are just a group that carries him through the adventure. But you have to do something because there are 13 of them in 3 2.5-hour movies.
If you were writing The Hobbit as an original screenplay, for instance, you wouldn't have 13 dwarves, you'd probably have 3 or 4 of them, and call it a day.
I was always okay with expanding the characters. You have to have people to root for, characters you can laugh at or quote.
Each of these dwarves have a role to play in the story. It was very important to us that we were able to give them their own personalities.
The problem is none of them were expanded that well. Does anybody remember Dory? That dwarf. We remember Gimli because he was sassy and funny. He had a distinct personality that stood out from the rest of the Fellowship. In fact, all of them were memorable and unique, and it helped that we got to know them individually. Frodo was the innocent protagonist, whose purity was corrupted over the trek. Gandalf was the wise wizard who liked fireworks, smoking, and basically knew everybody. Sam was the fussy, loyal friend who kept his spirits up. Merry and Pippin were the useless hooligans, but even they were differentiated. Merry was cunning and sensible, and Pippin was naive, and they were more than just comic relief. They had depth.
I know there is not much point now in hoping. If I were a knight of Rohan, capable of great deeds, but I'm not. I'm a hobbit.
The two men were different too. Aragorn was heroic, introspective, and romantic, with an air of mystery. Boromir was immediately established as rude, boasting, but even somewhat noble in the end. Legolas is the only elf in the group. He's ethereal, hopeful, and has to overcome prejudices. All of them have pretty defining weapons too. Frodo has Sting, Gandalf has his staff, Boromir has a giant shield. This iconic line comes from their different weapons.
You have my sword. And you have my bow.
And my axe.
The Fellowship became pop icons.
Ah, Gandalf, my old friend. I like what you've done with your beard.
Right, better clench up, Legolas.
Ninja Morgenstern! The hobbits, the hobbits, the hobbits, the hobbits, to Isengard, to Isengard!
None of the dwarves are iconic like this. Even Thorin, who gets ample screen time. Some people will watch all 3 movies and not even remember a single dwarf's name, not even Thorin's. It doesn't help that all of them are the same race, but Aragorn, Boromir, Faramir, Denethor, Theoden, Éomer, Grima, and Bard are all men, but everyone can tell them apart. I can tell the wild things apart. Plus, the caricature of dwarves can be pushed, and they took extra effort to make their looks distinct. And they look pretty good, so what went wrong? The dwarves should have been grouped better. Sometimes it's easier to remember pairs.
What you do have within this, the company of Thorin Oakenshield, are family groupings, which make it slightly easier to get to know them, I think.
Although Merry and Pippin are individualized characters, they're better known as a unit. One of the glaring missed opportunities is that none of the dwarves are particularly grouped together. Balin and Dwalin are nothing alike and don't even look like each other. Fili and Kili have completely different hair color. They're one description in the book. In fact, there's only one blonde in the group. Gloin was given red hair because of Gimli, but Oin has gray hair? Bifur and Bofur are cousins and they have black hair, but Bofur's brother Bombur has red hair, not to mention the size difference. Ori and Nori have sandy hair, but Dori is silver-haired. And how is it that the youngest member of the company has a senior citizen brother? What's worse is none of them really interact inside their name group. Balin and Dwalin have 2 scenes together. Fili and Kili have like 2.5 where they talk to each other. Bofur never interacts with his brother except to throw food at his face. They don't even sit near each other in the dinner scene. Keep in mind, these are our main characters. This is our fellowship. Can you imagine if Merry and Pippin only talked to each other in one scene, then just said expositional lines to Aragorn? They even talk about the other one when they aren't there.
I would get him into the worst sort of trouble. But I was always there to get him out.
Seriously, these dwarves are grouped together at the beginning and we're supposed to assume they have a relationship because they're brothers. But there aren't any real scenes that show them interacting. Thelma and Louise, Bonnie and Clyde, Sid and Nancy, Balin and Dwalin. So many characters are iconic solely because of their relationships with each other. Caring about a character often comes from how they feel about someone else. All of the dwarves just follow Thorin and bumble around on this adventure. No wonder no one remembers these characters.
I mean, the battle's one thing, but if you don't care about who's fighting in the battle, you may as well, it's just a complete waste of time.
Yeah. So I guess I'll start with Dwalin. Similar to the book, inexplicably, he doesn't show up with his brother, so even less character development. Dwalin looks pretty cool, but why did he go bald before Balin? He had a dumb-looking mullet mohawk in the flashback. I don't know, bad genetics maybe? If they were trying to distinguish each dwarf, why didn't he have a sick Maynard James Keenan or Travis Bickle mohawk? Beyond that, I'm okay with Dwalin. He's a gruff badass, but why is he on this quest besides loyalty? What does he do outside the quest if he isn't with his brother? What do any of them do?
Merchants, miners, tinkers, toy makers.
One of the reasons people can't connect to these movies in the same way is because we're never given any information other than a single character trait. In this case, a warrior. Balin's probably the most likable one here with any kind of depth. Next there's Feely. People complain about a lack of Bilbo, but Feely's just a cardboard cutout. We're not even told he's a prince until the end of the second movie.
Feely is the nephew of Thorin, so he's a young prince. Is that right? He is, must be right.
And they expect us to get choked up when he dies? Oh, which one is that again? What does he want? Does he want to be king?
Feels that weight of responsibility about potentially what he may become.
Why did he and his brother never talk about things? Keely is a little better because he gets a lot of screen time, but all we know is that he's reckless and he loves Tauriel. And where the hell is his beard? Aragorn has a longer beard in Return of the King. Oin's okay, and Gloin looks pretty good, but personality-wise, Oin is deaf and likes ravens, I guess.
Ravens have been seen flying back to the mountain.
A raven! I could probably come up with a decent ointment for you.
Except that wasn't in the movie, so who cares? Gloin is a banker, which they also don't mention. But hey look, it's Gimli's father. That dwarf you know and love. What's he actually like? Oh, no idea. Bifur has an axe in his head, so whatever. Bomber's fat. He doesn't even get lines until the 3rd extended edition.
There you go, cousin.
So why would I ever care about him? In the book he's a really great friend of Bilbo, but that's not the case here. And Bofur has a wonderful personality, but what is that shriveled excuse for a beard? And And lastly, we have Thorin. This character is actually one of the most interesting, second to Bilbo.
As I brought the character closer to the mountain, I wanted that to resonate within him already, like he could feel the gold even though he wasn't in contact with it. So we had to delay it and work out at what point was he going to hit rock bottom.
But he's partly paradoxical. Is he a jerk or a hero? Is he seeking gold or home? It's hard to really sympathize with someone when their personality isn't concrete, at least in this kind of film. Although I love his relationship with Bilbo, especially when there's personal conflict, it's more admirable how unrelenting Aragorn's kindness is, especially to Frodo. He's like Jesus.
I would have gone with you to the end.
He even tried to save Grima from execution. There's something likable about someone so unwavering. Thorin rides the line between complex and confused, and it's hard for an audience to really root for the guy. A complex character can work, but there's something missing. That's stature. And I don't mean height, though that doesn't help, but it's the way he's presented. Thorin is a skeptical character, and he often changes his mind about things. He's violent and arrogant.
Throw him from the ramparts!
And he's prone to mental illness. But the film does backflips to try to convince you he's a hero.
There is one who I could follow.
In touching personal scenes, Richard Armitage gives his all and understands his character deeply. But Thorin will never escape the idiots in the company. It's like that cool guy who hangs around a bunch of losers, and by association he becomes one too. Aragorn was always alone, and that made him cool. He didn't try to earn anyone's respect, but he took it anyway. And the movie shows that.
When last I looked, Theoden, not Aragorn, was king of Rohan.
He sings at night. We see that he has hunting and healing skills. We don't even know his name at first. He's mysterious. Every time he meets another leader, he steals the power. Elrond, Galadriel, Éomer, Theoden. He leads the Battle of Helm's Deep and charges the Black Gate. Aragorn blazes the trail wherever he goes. I'm not saying Thorin should be Aragorn, because he's a completely different character, but it's like they're trying to convince us that he is. Thorin is emasculated at every step of the journey. He loses his kingdom in the prologue. His introduction has nothing on Aragorn's. Gandalf puts him in his place, and he gets no leg up on Elrond either. After swinging a sword at trolls for 5 minutes, he ends up in a burlap sack. Imagine Aragorn in a burlap sack. He gets captured by goblins, he gets his ass kicked by Azog, he has to depend on Beorn's help, then he gets captured by both spiders and Thranduil. Then the once and future king flails around in a barrel, then he has to depend on both Bard and the Master. When he finally arrives at Erebor, he sends the Hobbit in first, and he can't even kill the dragon. He has to wait for Dane to send an entire army to save him. Thorin is a pansy. Any chance of regality is undercut by the story. I'd be fine with a character who can't seem to get anything right and messes up all the time, but they want you to think he's a mighty hero so badly. That was the point of the book. He was an old curmudgeon who got everything wrong, and at the end of it all, he saw how petty everything was. Jeez, he doesn't even have a full beard in this.
We decided that too long a beard on Richard was too distracting.
I know this is controversial. There was something I found to sort of ease my conscience. When the dwarves emerged from Erebor, they had singed beards, so the reason Thorin wears his beard short is in reverence to those dwarves that had died in the mountain.
First, that's nonsense, because his beard is that short in the prologue, but okay. What they're implying is that you can't act with a long beard. I hope no one tells Ian McKellen. Seriously, he's the only Tolkien actor to be nominated for an Oscar, and he wore a long beard and a prosthetic nose. His role as Gandalf is iconic. And Richard Armitage looks great, but would you accept Gandalf or Saruman or Radagast without a long beard? Then why do it here? None of these characters are memorable, at least not in the way we remember Lord of the Rings. They're likable, sure, but they don't feel like real people. They feel like characters in a school play production. Obviously some of the characters won't be fleshed out, but some of them have to be. I mean, they forgot to replace the stunt double with the actual Éomer on the left. But even he got to show some kind of real emotion. Other than Bilbo, none of the characters are characters at all, so none of it means anything. It's a touchy subject when you deviate from an original source material, whether it's from a book, or a comic, or even actual history. People will get outraged over anachronisms or eye color. What it boils down to is if someone feels like you're respecting what they love, because we have a preconceived notion if it's an adaptation, and we want the original to be respected because we encountered it first. And sometimes that can be literal, whether a character says a different line, or if a character resembles what you think it should be. I don't get too caught up in the minutia, as long as it feels right and the reason behind it makes sense and isn't arbitrary. Which brings us to Tauriel. I like the existence of her character, but not the execution of her character. See, the obvious reason she was created was because The Hobbit had no female characters in a book written in 1935. So for a modern audience, it needed a feminine touch, especially with the great women already established in Lord of the Rings. But is that pandering to assume women need an invented character to relate to? That really depends on the woman. Some women really identify with her and relish a break from all the men, but an equal number think it's stupid to change the book to suit something that may or may not have been necessary. So the question is, if it's a deviation, is it in the spirit of the book? The idea of an elven warrior in Thranduil's court makes sense to me. Someone who'd fight and see things from a different perspective than our heroes. But if they wanted a female character, did they forget they already had one? Oh, well, she doesn't really count because she's not involved with the main plot. Neither is Tauriel, really. They filmed Galadriel scenes at the beginning of the production when it was 2 films, and they already had the idea to invent a female character then. Why not use Galadriel? Then you have Bard's daughters and the women of Lake Town. Why does Tauriel bear the weight of being the female lead? I think it's because she gets so involved in the story. It's the same for Legolas. He should have had a cameo because it makes sense for him to be there. But they both overshadow Thranduil, the actual lead elf of the film. Thranduil is important to the story. He's the leader of the elven army and goes head to head with Thorin. He's also such a rich character, played brilliantly by Lee Pace.
The elves work in nature in such a harmonious way, and there's that element of nature that is very much a part of his spirit, I believe. He's a wild thing. And the wild is a dangerous place.
The problem is he's a newcomer, and the filmmakers didn't trust the story they were telling. Really, if Tauriel is such a warrior, and Thranduil is even older than Legolas, why don't they also jump around and do cool stuff like him? Surely Legolas isn't the only elf who can do backflips. There wasn't enough confidence in the new characters, so they banked on old ones. Legolas is there to appeal to nostalgia, and Tauriel is there to appeal to women, assuming women even relate to her at all. The movie's agenda gets too big for the characters. The fact that Tauriel is pigeonholed as the one female character is a little unfair. Being the sole representation of a demographic means bearing all the criticisms of that demographic. I think it's important to include women in media, and it even makes sense in the story. But putting her on a pedestal to represent all women doesn't work. The original trilogy had 3 well-developed women, who were characters first and social impact second. Their inclusion as women didn't disrupt the story, it was a part of it. Tauriel's character isn't really a character, it's just an archetype. She's a restless warrior. There may be some nuance in the performance, but on the page, she's just a set of traits. This is true of every other character in the Hobbit films, but again, representing one demographic paints a pretty big target. So I guess we should talk about love. Tolkien stories are all about love. Love of home, love of things, familial love, brotherly love, platonic love, unrequited love, a lack of love, and yes, romantic love. What's important is that Lord of the Rings treated all of these the same. In The Hobbit, there are some, albeit toxic friendships, but there's not this unifying theme of love between characters. Bard has children, but how does he actually feel about them as people? Does he like one more than the other? Why? Does he joke around with them, or is he overly strict? Does he give them any advice? They're basically just objects for him to fight for, and not actual characters. That's why this moment is really nice.
Look at me. You look at me.
Which brings us to Keely and Tauriel. I don't want to be cynical because I think this pairing is kind of cute, but their relationship is solely based on their chemistry and good looks, which is tolerable but not substantial. Plus it's pretty bold to shove it on your one made-up character, but it's wrong for several reasons. 1. It happens in one day. After one scene together, Keely's ready to draw her bowstring.
It would be hard to do a lot of things with Tauriel if it was to become a dwarven elven marriage, I would imagine. Although he's willing to give it a shot.
It's hard to buy a romance based on one day because we know it's unrealistic. The only example I know that works is Before Sunrise, because the entire movie is one long conversation between two characters.
Jump ahead 10, 20 years, okay? And you're married. And only your marriage doesn't have that same energy that it used to have. You know, you start to blame your husband. You start to think about all those guys you've met in your life and what might have happened if you picked up with one of them, right? Well, I'm one of those guys. That's me.
And they don't really fall in love either. They meet and connect like real people and slowly grow over the course of the film. It's still unrealistic, but it doesn't feel that way because we discover the relationship with them. Plus, they're self-aware too. They have one day to spend together, so they enjoy it. It gets even deeper in the sequels every 9 years, when their relationship changes and becomes less idealistic.
I put up with plenty of your shit. And if you think I'm just some dog who's gonna keep coming back, then you're wrong. But if you want true love, then this is it.
My point is we can actually buy day-old romances if it's not strictly based on one scene.
Do you think she could have loved me?
No. 2. Why do they like each other? I can see how they bond over being young and restless, and maybe archery, but there's nothing they can really relate to. I don't need a romance film to make my point. Just look at Aragorn, Middle-earth's ladies' man. Eowyn is living in a ghost town, and sees Aragorn as a liberator of sorts. He's the first person to really understand her. She sees him calm the horse with Elvish. He asks her about her fears, and gives her hope and courage. They get to know each other on the road. Then she grieves for him when she thinks he's dead, and rejoices when he's alive. And note that Theoden is the one who denies her from battle, because Aragorn always supports her. And they still don't end up together. All of this character development for unrequited love. Aragorn and Arwen's love is a little more basic, but it helps to already establish a couple. You don't have to set up every reason they like each other when they've been together for years, but they still have things in common. They're both healers, and Aragorn pretty much loves determined, intelligent women. She offers him support and insight when he's doubtful. See, Aragorn is nothing but confident around others because he's a natural leader. When he's with her, he can be insecure, and she helps his worries. They might not be super deep lovers, but they have reasons to be together, and we're shown enough scenes with them to understand the nature of their relationship. They kiss and hold hands. She makes quips at him. He trusts her in dangerous situations. And we even see Aragorn's relationship with her father. Even in the Two Towers, when Arwen's basically sitting around, we see flashbacks of them being close, so we're happy when they're reunited. With Keely and Tauriel, I just don't see it. Probably because their characters aren't fully developed first, so we can't actually see what they have in common.
Because it was real.
Was it? 3. What's worse was that this was a dwarven elvish romance. If they had to put a romance in, I would have been okay with a little flirtmance with Legolas. You know, the character she already knew. Scenes where they hunt or talk about elvish things or a mutual dislike of dwarves. Then maybe they would slowly drift apart, or she would die in the battle. So Legolas would be forced to bury the pain and memory of her by the time he joined the Fellowship. It just makes more sense because elves and dwarves hate each other. A Romeo and Juliet feud doesn't instantly make me care. It also ruins the entire point of Gimli and Legolas's friendship. They hated each other at first, and they seemed annoyed at each other's existence. But then they went through the adventure together and learned to appreciate each other.
What about side by side with a friend?
But apparently this is a common occurrence, because they fall in love after one conversation, completely ignoring centuries of ingrained prejudice. I mean, Gimli was pretty much smitten with Galadriel, but she was kind of incredulous and toyed with him. Technically she was married, which they probably forgot about, but she wouldn't have feelings for him anyway. She was completely above this idiot. And yes, Tauriel is a Sylvan elf and all, but she has the poise and maturity of a 13-year-old girl. And lastly, it's a little salacious to force your only female character into a rushed romance. I mean, Age of Ultron got enough flack for that. Now, women fall in love, of course, but solely being a romantic interest without any agency is antiquated. Supporting characters get only a little screen time, even less so in a big cast, and they can't distract from the protagonist too much. So they should basically have one thing to do. They can be complex, but in this type of movie, their time should be focused. Again, Eowyn loved Aragorn, sure, but her character wasn't about that. It was about her growth, from dour and oppressed, to finally being happy and independent. And any interaction with Aragorn was in service of that. I thought Tauriel's character was about being an intermediate between elves and dwarves. She seemed to distrust a lot of what Thranduil said about isolation, and wanted to participate in the world in a neutral and objective way. It's one of the reasons I liked her addition, because I thought she was going to teach the same lesson to Legolas. So there's a transition between a stuck-up prince and an elf willing to help humanity and fellowship. Again, another reason why they should have been together if they had to have a romance. But anything vaguely clever they set up in Desolation of Smaug was completely ignored, because Tauriel's character devolved only into a romance plot. It's all she becomes about. I liked her a lot in the second movie, because she did her own thing, and was actually kind of weirded out by this guy. At this point, no one really knew how she felt about Keeley, so we all had the benefit of the doubt that she turned him down and basically friend-zoned these guys, and do more important things like become involved in the world and try to convince Thranduil not to go to war. I thought for sure she'd martyr herself. Honestly, it's baffling how much potential they set up only to have her fawn over Keeley like a lovesick puppy. Maybe I was a little naive when I saw the second one, but I just assumed she would do something more meaningful than cry about this guy.
Tauriel saw next to no action. I mean, she killed a couple orcs on her way to trying to save Keeley, and that was sort of it.
She saw a little dwarf action.
Yeah.
She's a little dwarf action.
Lunch break letdown. No.
Again, it's not that a romance is bad, but it's that the romance doesn't service her character for anything greater. Notice when Keeley dies, she doesn't have any more scenes after that. Yep. Everything led to this. What does she do after this? How does she affect Legolas at all? We're never told, which means she was completely bound to Keeley. Of course, Keeley's character was just as bound to her. This was all he was about too, but every other character in the story is a man, so it's not as sinister. I don't blame Peter or Fran or Philippa for this misstep.
In order to take this job, you have to promise me I will not be in a love triangle. I swear to God, this is what I said to them.
Basically, the studio wanted the love story in there.
And then we came back for reshoots, and seriously, this was added.
It's easy to blame the studio because they do this stuff all the time. And it sucks, because the people distributing your movie get a lot of say in the end product. But at the same time, I'm disappointed by how the writers handled it. Did they already tell the studio off on some of the problem and didn't have any more cards to play? Or were they just pushovers? Are we supposed to believe Peter Jackson didn't have any say in the Hobbit trilogy? You have to fight for what you believe in, but even if they couldn't, they didn't rise to the challenge at all. Just because the studio forces a romance, does that mean you can't wrap up your character at the end or develop the relationship better? Take a weekend and write some scenes and explore these characters and why they might fall in love. I know a movie is a ridiculous amount of work and Peter had a million things to do, but they should have taken the time to really think about how this would affect the movie if they didn't get it right, because it basically undermined their empowered female character. All the awesome archery moves amount to nothing when she's just a love-drunk crybaby with no personality. So this is my last point. Other than basic characters, everything I've talked about has been kind of a minor problem. When you put it together, it feels like all the pennies count. But if you take away all the hard work and millions of dollars that went into making the movie, what's left is the script, the most important part of a film. There's an incredible visual consistency through the films, but the dialogue is one of the most shocking differences. You might not have even noticed. Philippa Boyens is so well spoken about Tolkien lore, I'm not sure what happened. Almost every single line in The Hobbit is vague or expositional. Every line is about getting somewhere or something will happen.
You have to be standing in exactly the right spot at exactly the right time.
Take back your homeland.
This is not a nice place to meet.
No, it is not.
These bats are bred for one purpose.
For what?
For war.
They have been bred for war.
Going to take out their leader.
It's so bland and modern.
I'm gonna kill that piece of filth.
There's no poetry anymore. What I loved about The Lord of the Rings was the way people spoke. It's understated and poetic.
Here you will dwell, bound to your grief under the fading trees, until all the world is changed and the long years of your life are utterly spent.
Mostly because they appropriated lines from the 3 massive books. Tolkien wasn't great at writing natural dialogue. His characters spoke in historical speeches, rarely like actual conversations, but there's a particular style in his writing that caters for it. In the films, they found a way to blend beautiful phrases with natural dialogue.
So loud, we could have shot him in the dark.
Why do you think the Gollum scene and the dragon scene were so good? Because they audibly sound different from the rest of the film, lifted nearly word for word from the page.
The tales and songs fall utterly short of your enormity, O Smaug, the stupendous.
I know The Hobbit doesn't have the immense amount of material that The Lord of the Rings had to offer, but even the way Tolkien wrote the text could be altered to fit dialogue. How did the writers lose so much of their talent? Take a look at these 2 scenes about emotionally trapped heroines, and see if you can tell the difference.
Who knows what you've spoken to the darkness in the bitter watches of the night, when all your life seems to shrink, the walls of your bower closing in about you, a hutch to trammel some wild thing.
Legolas said you fought well today. He has grown very fond of you.
I assure you, my lord, Legolas thinks of me as no more than a captain in the guard.
Perhaps he did once. Now, I'm not so sure.
It's so literal. It's like a soap opera. There's no grace, no subtlety. Everything is spelled out. There aren't any actual scenes in these movies. They're just expressions and lines to tell us what's happening. There's a lot happening with Éowyn. She feels trapped in a social cage, dealing with the loss of her cousin and the slow decay of her uncle, exploiting her uselessness, her worst fear. Then Grima deconstructs her and preys on her emotions, and for a moment his words are almost seductive, before she realizes they're poisonous. All from one beautifully phrased monologue. What happens with Tauriel? Legolas has a crush on her, and apparently tells his father about it like a teenager, but she doesn't really think of him the same way. Just because you spin the words to sound a little old-timey, doesn't make them poetic or insightful. Take another look about how they discuss the evil of Sauron.
Sauron has regained much of his former strength. He cannot yet take physical form, but his spirit has lost none of its potency.
Concealed within his fortress, the Lord of Mordor sees all. His gaze pierces cloud, shadow, earth, and flesh. You know of what I speak, Gandalf. A great eye, lidless, wreathed in flame.
The enemy has returned. He is summoning his servants. Azog the Defiler is no ordinary hunter. He is a commander of legions. The enemy is preparing for war.
It's like all they know how to write are trigger words. Evil, danger, enemy, war. Also, notice how many assumptions Gandalf makes in The Hobbit. In The Lord of the Rings, he didn't fully trust Saruman about an assault against Middle-earth.
You know this.
In The Hobbit, he just assumes the necromancer is building an army because the script needs him to. Another odd thing you might not have noticed is how every orc speaks in black speech. Languages are a great way to add authenticity, especially in fantasy, and it's beautiful to hear these languages. But no regular person can quote them or recognize them. I don't think any orc lines are that universal, but at least casual fans of The Lord of the Rings will recognize them like cult moments.
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys!
It's hard to really do that when they all speak in different languages.
Speak words we can all understand.
Any criticism of The Lord of the Rings was that it's too long and all it's about are the characters walking. But they missed the point that it's not about the journey, it's what happens on the journey. It's about people growing in friendship, suffering loss, and dealing with grief, living away from home, coping with war, and the destruction of humanity and the earth. The Hobbit literally is about the journey. Lord of the Rings was lightning in a bottle, and it could never be repeated. I honestly love the Hobbit movies. They're fun and entertaining and creative, and there are so many things they get right. Martin Freeman's Bilbo is perfect, and the action is slick. The costumes and creature designs are exciting, and the music is always brilliant. But it fails to live up to what came before it, and that is why it's disappointing.